All right, so welcome to the Baton Rouge Astronomical Society. The president for the year 2019, and tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about how to do basic elementary planetary photography using cell phones and some introductory equipment. All the equipment that I'm going to be suggesting here is going to be for the PC, and it's all going to be the type of thing that is going to be readily available on the internet for free. But I'm mainly going with PC instead of Mac. So if you're going to want to use a Mac to do any of this stuff, you can either do a little bit of research and try and find similar programs on the internet for the Mac, or to run an emulator and download these same programs. So let's go ahead and get started. The basic idea here is we're going to break it down into three basic components. We're going to have the capture, the stacking, and then the further editing. And actually, we're going to add another one before stacking. We're going to have pre-processing. And the pre-processing is just going to be because we want to center out some of this video before if we're using something like a DAW, where it's manually the image capture is going to be manually guided. We're going to want to find some way of keeping the image centered into the frame of view and slightly stabilized so that we know that it's not going to be floating all around the place when we're trying to line this guy up. And we've got a very good program that'll take every little one of these dots and sort of add this up. So the two basic methods that we've got are going to be with eyepiece projection and with prime focus photography. Eyepiece projection photography is really, really simple stuff. This is where you just throw the eyepiece into the regular telescope like you would normally, and then you focus the planet, line it up, and then you just take a regular old camera, whether it's a DSLR or a cell phone. Most likely these days it's a cell phone, and you just record the video of what's happening through the eyepiece, or just take a regular picture. Whether you take a picture or you do video is going to depend entirely on whether you're trying to do planets or something a little bit larger like the moon or the sun. The moon or the sun do very well with still pictures. When you're trying to do planets, it gets a little bit better to do video, so that we can do something called lucky imaging, which is taking those 60 frames per second that you get from your video, picking out each one and finding out those individual frames that have bits and pieces of good seeing and good viewing inside of that time frame. So you'll shoot like 2 minutes of video, and it'll pick out, those 1,000 frames or whatever, and you'll stitch it together from the best parts of each one of those individual images from the video.
Scott, one basic question.
Shoot.
This Barrow, if you don't mind. Let's see, when you're doing the eyepiece projection, are you setting the focus on, assuming you're not using an autofocus cell phone, are you setting it to infinity, or how are you focusing on the image on the eyepiece?
This is a good question, and I've actually been playing around with this myself. Generally, when I start off, I leave the focus at the same thing that I would do for the eye. And what I found is that when I throw the cell phone on afterward, it's not quite the same focus. So what I'll do is I'll have to refocus it looking at the screen. And generally speaking, what I'll do is I'll just lock the focus on the camera and adjust it so that it comes into focus afterward. And this is, I think, basically because the main difference between the eye and the camera is when you're looking through the eye, you're trying to put it through the retina of the eye there, versus when you're doing the same thing, you're trying to get it onto a slightly smaller retina that is on the inside of the cell phone camera. And whether you've got a larger camera, it'll have a slightly larger aperture and things like that. So you're actually going to be focusing it on a slightly different levels there. And the image has to land flat on the sensor, and whether that's in the back of the eye or on the back of the camera sensor, these are going to be two slightly different focal points. You can manually change the focus with the camera, and it's sometimes a lot easier to do that to help you get focus, but that's still the focus for the digital zoom on the cameras is going to be the same, because you're just enlarging the image. So generally speaking, you just want to keep the zoom separate for the camera and the eye. Okay, so first thing that you're going to want to do with the eye, we're going to start with the eyepiece projection, and we're going to edit these things exactly the same way. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find a nice eyepiece with a good eye relief. You don't really need too much magnification. The idea is these cell phone cameras that we're going to be using have very, very high pixel counts. They're very, very detailed, and they're getting better all the time. So generally speaking, I think something like a 10 millimeter or what I've got here is a 17 millimeter is fine. The idea here is that you're going to want a lot of room to play with when you've got the image in the view. You don't want to fill the eyepiece, and you don't want to go over the magnification limit that you would have if you were just doing this visually speaking. The camera isn't going to really stitch together much more detail than that. So the one thing that you can do to help you, once you've got your eyepiece and everything like that, is a nice little setting tool. And these guys comes in lots of different varieties. Chris?
I wanted to make a comment that on eyepiece projection that I agree with. You can actually go to a longer eyepiece than 17, but the distance between the sensor on the camera, whatever the camera is, whether it's a DSLR or a cell phone or whatever, to the focal point of the eyepiece can be changed to change magnification. And you can get some absolutely insane apparent magnifications with eyepiece projection. And if you're not careful, you can push it way too far real easily.
And mind you, this is something that I was trying out the other night when I was going forward, is using a digital zoom to really amp up the magnification. What I found was those images look good as stills and as video, but they didn't stack very well. And as a result, the final image did not process very well at all. So in that sense, you could probably do that with still photography. And I think Ben has been doing some of that, and he's actually got a nice program for his phone. And I've seen some of the stuff he's done. It's pretty good, but it's not the lucky imaging. It's just trying to steady the camera and take a good snapshot. And you can
I've done it with sunspots where I was able to do eyepiece projection and do it single image.
And single image does really well.
And
for
real
both
fast too. It was
lunar
very
stuff
fast shutter
and
speed.
lunar and solar stuff does really, really well that way. And if you're just trying to get some things like a nice planetary conjunction with the moon, it does really well that way also. But when we're really trying to pull off details of very small and very faint objects, the lucky imaging really is the way to go. I don't think I've ever pulled off an eye of Jupiter that way. I think that some people have better luck with it. Maybe I just don't practice as much as I can. But either way, one of the things, I've got better ways of doing it. Why waste my time? But one of the things that can be very useful when trying to do eyepiece projection photography is finding a steadying tool. And there are various types of tools that they have readily available. And they range the gamut from the cheap to the very expensive. I think that the TeleView model is over $100, and I don't even know what that benefit is going to do. But here's the simplest one that I've found. This is something that I got from a Toys R Us that was going bankrupt, and we have, thanks to Ben, thanks for like $2. And all this is basically is a hole cut with a little flat board. And mind you, you could do the same thing, but with going to AutoZone and getting one of those clamps and sticking a nail in it and just putting it and duct taping it to a board. Just anything that'll fit the eyepiece and that it can latch onto and stay flat. For slightly more than that, you get something like this, which is actually very, very nice. What this is a screw top, and you can just sort of throw your phone onto a thing like that, and then, or screw in an eyepiece like that. Make sure it's flush. Then you put the phone on top of it like that. Yeah. You get a nice little.
I used to own one of those that had a stage for a DSLR. So
yeah, and they do sell one. A very, very fancy version of this is for the DSLR, which comes in two pieces. That you put the eyepiece in the center of it, then you put the second on top of it. You put the DSLR, screw it on top with a regular cell phone mount, an M42 mount, screw it in with the bayonet, and then you can slide in and out the camera in order to get the right distance that way. But that's mainly specifically for DSLR, doing eyepiece projection that way. And then, of course, there's this really fancy one that has all sorts of knobs and gizmos that helps you steady the thing on top of it. And this is the Celestron, NextYZ, which is absolutely fantastic. The prices of those are coming down a lot. So if you find yourself doing a lot of imaging of the moon or trying to do planets, that's worth the investment, I think, is to wait for it to come on sale for like $50. It's a good buy, instead of the $10 one that you got here, which is only hard to do because the basically you slide it in and out that way, and then that way to get the camera on top of the eyepiece, and it can be very time consuming, versus the other one where you just sort of turn knobs. But anyway, so the next thing is make sure that you've got your camera, you've got it steadied on the eyepiece and is now inserted into the tube like that. You make sure that the camera lens is perfectly on top of it. You can just throw it on the video, crank up the bright. You sometimes, if you flash a flashlight into the front of the tube, you can help yourself with trying to center the bright white object that appears in the tube, so you can make sure the camera is nice and centered on top of everything. I would use a red light for that. You don't want to blind yourself, and you don't want to ruin your night vision. Generally, it's also, you can set this up in the daytime, so you're not fumbling around in the dark, which can be really, really annoying, especially if it gets really hot and the mosquitoes are out.
Scott, one other question.
Sure.
It's Barrow again. For your camera lens, what length lens are you just looking for? A standard 35 millimeter, or are you looking as far as what focal length on the lens?
That's a good question. I think when you're doing eyepiece projection, you don't need a lens per se. You can just use the lens that is, you can use a specialized adapter to use a regular telescope lens to center the image on the chip. If you're going to be doing it with just a DSLR on a telescope and just inserting it in through a C-mount or what have you, then you're going to want to go for the largest focal length that you can find with the most aperture. In that case, you'd want to hook it into your C8 or what have you, and really go at it. When you're,
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted. I apologize.
No, I was right at the end of it. I was about to launch into a suggestion on the types of telescopes to use for this. Generally speaking, the people these days for doing planetary stuff have been leaning towards high F ratio SCTs, and if you happen to be lucky enough to have a really nice refractor, such as, I mean, if you went and stole the one on top of the LSU, that would be really great for planetary work. But generally speaking, most of them don't have as much aperture and with as much focal length to really do good work on planets. The main thing with planets is you want a high focal ratio, because you want to be able to pull in as much detail as you possibly can and get as much bit depth as you can.
Okay, well, the comment I was going to make is that if you're going to use a DSLR instead of a cell phone or some kind of point and shoot or something, I personally believe, especially if you have an SCT or long, you got to, not a Newtonian, okay? If you have something that you can reach focus with well, I think personally that even on planetary, since you're shooting a movie anyway, that it's better to go prime focus, especially with a long focal length scope. If you do prime focus, you can do your basically do your magnification in the software when you're after you stack out and you start working on your deal. You just simply crop and resize the image.
Well, and also there's some nicer tools that you can use when doing the stacking. There's gosh, I always forget the exact word for it, but there's a way that the same basic tools that NASA developed for increasing the resolution on the Hubble has now washed down to the rest of us, so we can use that to help use double the size of an image and increase the resolution. And it's I'll get into that when we start getting into it. One more thing about the telescopes is that a lot of people will find that they have trouble when they're using the short focal length Newtonian reflectors, especially when they start putting in these prime focus cameras, because they find that they can't get focus no matter what they do. And part of that is because the focal length is going to, the actual for the cameras, because of the difference between chips and eyes and things like that, the actual focal plane is going to be inside the tube for these short focal length Newtonians. And so the two ways to get around that is to either cut the tube open and move the mirror forward a little bit, which is sort of the funny way of saying, yeah, you can't do it that way. Or the easy way is to take a Barlow lens, throw that on top of the camera that you stick into the eyepiece, and that will double the focal length, and that'll allow you to achieve focus that way. And generally shooting at f10, f20 is not a problem, so it works out very well. So when you start off doing, you've now got the camera lined up and you've stuck it onto the tube. First thing is you're going to want to use the finder scope. Find the actual object using the finder scope. Check your phone back and forth until you make sure that the planet is actually showing up on the screen there. And then the tricky bit is either you can move the scope in such a way that the planet will drift through the eyepiece so that everything looks very, very calm and very, very smooth. Or if you've got a little bit of talent too, you can actually try and manually hold the scope back and forth, which is not that hard, even at using a 10 millimeter on a 1200 millimeter focal length tube. It's tricky and your arm will get tired over the course of a couple of minutes, but it'll still hold it fairly well. Most of these stops will, there's not that much movement.
Typically 90 seconds is all you're going to need in a movie. If you get much longer than that, you're not going to find a computer that a lot of us have that stack something that big.
So this is again one of the other things is that when you're once you've got it lined up, you're going to want to fire off the video, start the video. You're going to want to keep the gain on the camera, which is just the brightness. If you punched in, you've locked it down, you can scroll down on most iPhones or most cell phones that I know of to bring the brightness down very, very low. Because generally when you're trying to stack things later on, it will brighten the image up. So even though it looks like you're barely able to see the planet when you're taking the cell phone video, you're gonna want to keep it very, very low, as low as you can. When I was shooting, mind you, Jupiter's at opposition right now, so when I was shooting it last week to try and make this next image, or this image that I'm going to show y'all in a minute, I had brought the image down as low as it could possibly go. I probably could have stopped down to 8 inches and gotten it a little bit dimmer, and it was still too bright to really do the work that I wanted it to do. So there are some nice little programs you can run, you can buy for the camera that'll let you bring the brightness down very, very far. And adjust the exposure times and things like that. But again, I'm trying to keep this as cheap as I can because I'm a cheapskate. What can I say? So once you've got the video, you let it run for about 2 minutes or so, a minute or so, however long you can hold it. But generally, you don't want to go over 2 minutes for Jupiter at least, because after 2 minutes, because Jupiter moves very, very fast, you will start to see it rotating and you will blur the details. So the image that you start with after 2 minutes is going to be moved slightly. So you're no longer able to perfectly line these objects up, and it will always look a little bit fuzzy, even if your zoom is tack on. And that's going to be true on each way of doing the type of photography that I've got. Generally speaking, I used to go 3 minutes for Jupiter, 6 minutes for Saturn, and Mars just rotates at about the same speed of the Earth, so knock yourself out. But there is actually a really, really nice article in this month's Sky and Telescope that's done by a fellow who does world-class planetary photography by the name of Damian Peach, and he was recommending shooting in about 2 minutes. So I tried 2 minutes, and yeah, 2 minutes is fine. There's not much between 2 minutes and 3 minutes for my taste. So if the experts are saying 2, go for 2. The main thing is you want as many frames as you can get, because you want every split second of perfect seeing to maximize your chance of getting the perfect picture. Okay, so
I think you just hit the nail on the head. Seeing,
yeah, and
the atmosphere jumping around can really cause some headaches.
And mind you, I think that really, if you want to get good at planetary photography, Louisiana is not the place to do it unless you're trying to learn. It's like trying to learn to drive stick in New Orleans with the street cars, like my mother did. It's like, well, you'll learn it, but it's going to be very, very painful as you do, and you're gonna not have a good time. But yeah, if you go up onto a mountaintop, and you're going to get better shots. If you go over to the desert, you're going to get much better. You can use larger scopes and things like that.
Shoot as close to the zenith as you can.
So when we move on to prime focus photography, well, we've got our cell phone video now. What we're going to start doing is we're going to have dedicated cell phone or dedicated type cameras. And these can be anything from a webcam to these dedicated astronomy cameras now. Back when they started, webcams got it really, really popular back in the 80s or in the 90s and the early 2000s. People were finding easy ways to mod webcams so that you could stick them into an eyepiece to do this. And sure enough, the big companies were all like, well, we make great sensors. We can do that and we can make better cameras. And sure enough, you can find these all over, made by pretty much everybody. Orion, Celestron, Adica, ZWO, pretty much, and S-Bony, a couple of knockoffs that, well, not knockoffs, a couple of other lesser known companies that you can find on Amazon and high in the listings and things like that. So the idea here is that instead of now recording entirely in one place, you're going to be using a computer program to help you out. And in order to do that, you're going to have to find yourself a couple of really nice tools to help you out. You're going to need a program of some kind. And that's actually one of the programs I forgot to put up in my list of things to include here. So you just give me a second. Generally speaking, there are a bunch of different programs out there. The one that I think does that I'm choosing to demonstrate tonight is going to be a program called SharpCap. And what the big benefit of SharpCap is nothing in particular. It's just easy to use and it seems to work pretty well. Another popular program is called Fire Capture. And I think everybody uses that. A lot of people tend to use that because it's got some really nice advanced tools. The big problem there is that I've been having issues with my particular camera on the frame rate. And of course, every camera that's made today pretty much comes with its own proprietary capture software. So you'll end up with Orion has their own, Celestron, ZWO, ADIC, all these people have their own particular programs. But again, most of the cameras will work with SharpCap, and SharpCap will also have its own, it can pretty much run on any camera you find, even the old webcams that you've got. I remember taking apart an old life cam for this purpose at one point and centering it on top of an old film canister so I could put it in the eyepiece. It's cool, but again, you don't really need it. So let's go ahead and show y'all what I'm talking about with this guy here. Yep, SharpCap is going to look something like this guy here. Generally speaking, it'll pull up the type of camera that you've got. In this case, I'm going to throw it onto a test camera, but you would generally pick out your own camera there. And the main thing that you're basically going to be looking for, and of course, this is a much better shot of Saturn than you'll get through any of your cameras, unless you're sitting on a mountaintop with a 20-inch with perfect seeing. But the basic thing that every camera is going to have is it's going to have exposure and gain. And the capture between the two of these is going to be able to determine what you're actually going to be shooting here. So generally speaking, you're going to bring the exposure down to, wow, that's absolutely a terrible image. I'm not sure why this is a test camera, to tell you the truth. So let's just, yeah, we'll keep it. But generally speaking, your exposure is going to determine how long of a picture you're taking. And you're going to want to keep these down as low as you can to match the histogram so that it goes over a certain level. And the gain is going to be allow you to take shorter exposures while still keeping the object bright. The main thing that you're going to be looking at when you're trying to capture the thing is you're going to be looking at this histogram. And generally speaking, this line here will move back and forth as you change your exposure and your gain back and forth here. The idea, you want to keep it in about the 70 to 80% range here. Because again, just like when we're taking the cell phone images, it's going to actually get brighter as we stack it later on. So once you've lined up the camera and it's sitting on the planet and it's perfectly centered in the eyepiece, unlike what their test camera has done here, you set the focus manually. You can do that with a couple of different tools that you've got. In particular, there is something called a focus assistant. You can start bringing up the edge detection right there, and that will generally start kicking you out a level as you change the focus. This will go up and down, and the idea is to try and keep the focus to be about 0 through the best one that you get from averaging several seconds over time. And generally you can set that once you've got the thing in the proper focus and you've aligned it up. So generally speaking, when you stop this just because it's distracting. All right. So generally what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to throw the eyepiece into the telescope, slew over to the object. And again, at this point, you're using a computer-aided telescope. So you're going to be able to track it and follow the motion of the planet automatically, because at this point, you're no longer going to be able to sit around and manually hold the thing in place. But you could, but it's a lot easier if you use a regular old telescope like that, because, well, just a computer telescope. So once you've got the thing in place in the eyepiece, you take the eyepiece out, you insert the new camera into the eyepiece, then you fire up the program, you set the gain and the exposure rate. Generally, they'll have presets for each one of the planets on most of the capture programs. Start off there, raise the gain up a little bit so that you can help make sure that the planet is still centered, and you can get the rough focus, because you're going to have a little bit of difference between the focus when you've got a diagonal in there and when you stick it in. But you're going to want to remove the diagonal so you can look straight through, because again, you just don't want any extra, dust from the mirror of the diagonal or anything like that. And this will cause a major change in the focal length, which means you're going to have a couple of cranks on the old knob to get it into focus there. So once you've hit the gain, you've got the thing, you've got the rough focus from finding the planet. The idea is to then lower the gain back down so that it's probably, I generally like a 200 gain for Jupiter, 300 gain for Saturn. And then you just sort of change the exposure length so that it's right about where you want it to be. And again, you're trying to keep the histogram in that 60 to 80% range of maximum. If it goes to the further end, then you've actually overexposed it. And if it goes to the left end, you're going to be underexposing it. And in general, anything that's on the low end that gets clipped off the back is data that's lost, which is all just technical stuff, and you don't need to know that. The main thing is to keep the little curvy line at about 60 to 70%, and that's about where you want to go. So there are some other things you can do to help you bring in a little bit more stability and help you when you're shooting at with a nice enough camera. The data on this is going to be sky high. So one of the things you can do is load up your ROI, which is a field of, okay, which is basically just going to be a matter of generally speaking, it's yeah, I hate sharp cap. What can I say? But it is the easiest thing to use. So what are you going to do? Actually, there's a proprietary camera system that I've been using lately called ZWO, which is much easier to use than anything on the market, and really captures very nice frame rates and is simple to use. But generally speaking, what you're going to want to do is when you've got the planet centered in, you're going to right click and drag a box around the planet, and that will center the ROI. So you're only going to be recording the little bit that has the planet in it instead of recording a bunch of black space around it. And that's going to save you a bunch of file space when you're starting to go through the recording and processing. Okay, once you've got all of your things set up and it is a perfectly, the image is aligned, it's in focus, the exposures are set up right, Try and again, you start the recording for about 2 minutes and save it as an SER or an AVI file, depending on how fancy you want to get. AVI is fine. That'll record for about 2 minutes, and after you've got your data, then you move on to the next step, which is going to be pre-processing. The pre-processing program that I've found is this one program called PIP, which is a picture-in-picture explorer program. Generally, you pull up your regular file type thing from the image that you picked up. In this case, this is the image 4855. Pull it up. It will then bring up a second image, which is going to be your planet there, and you start changing around the options. Tick the planetary thing. This will allow it to center the object. You go through into various processing options. And some of these are pretty interesting depending on exactly how fancy you want to get. But the big one that we're going for is planetary stabilization, which is already enabled here. So you can go through down this right column here. And basically, when you look over to this thing on the left side, you want to make sure that when you test the detection, it's able to find the planet that you've got. So in this case, I've got an old copy of Jupiter. And yep, sure enough, it's highlighted in red. And you can change this option right here in order to make that more or less, depending on what you need in order to get it perfect. And this is very simple, very easy thing to do. You resize the frame and make sure that it crops it so that that'll do well. And then that's it. You want to make sure that it's still set to an AVI or an SER to kick it out. And then you go to the do processing, hit the start processing button, and it will kick out the program that you're looking for. So that after a while, you will end up with the thing that it will kick out is going to be, a file that looks a little bit like this. So if this is the original file that we have, lots of nice images and noise that are surrounding it. You get the car horns and you get a very dancey type image that floats around like that and everything like that. Not very good for stacking. However, once we move it over and we run it through the PIP, you end up with something that's a little bit like this. Slowed down, image is a lot more stable. The thing is pretty much centered in the field of view. It's not dancing around too much. Oh, this might be the wrong file. Yep, that's the wrong file. That is one that I had done there it is. So this is now centered. It's actually cropped it out, and it's made sure that the planet, no matter what was happening in the rest of the film, just keeps it absolutely centered in the field of view. You can see how that goes much, much more nicely. Everything looks very nice, very smooth.
We're not seeing it. All we're seeing is your menu.
Oh, geez. Yeah, okay, so that's not working out very well. Let me see.
I could imagine it well, though.
Thank you, Ben. It's the, let's see. So it doesn't look like it wants to let me show video over that. Maybe. Yeah, it's not going to let me show the video over the the video of the video. So what if, maybe if I do the, let's see. Is that showing anything now?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the same basic idea, the cell phone video that I had from earlier. This is run through the PIP. It's now stabilized. It's slightly enlarged the file. I don't necessarily like the way that it's fuzzied it up, which is why I was running that other file. But again, it's all gravy. And then this is from the original file that we had, which you should have the audio from that. There, and that's visible?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see how it just sort of dances around and it moves. It's not quite right. So this is what the picture-in-picture thing does, and that is why we use the pre-processing, is just because it helps put that into the right file. Okay, so great. Once we've moved on from the pre-processing, what we're going to do is we're going to throw it into our stacking program. And the stacking program is going to look, if I can, we're going to be using the auto stackert which is this fella here. I don't know if you can actually see the options panel here or whether you're just looking at that one little dot with the red around it. Probably just seeing that little dot with the red around it. Let me see.
Scott, what's the program name?
Auto Stacker. There we go. This is the other version of that. This is the 3.0 version. The 2.0 version is a little bit more stable. So basically, the idea here is the same. You pull up the thing, the open. You pull up the stabilized image. Say that guy there. It's going to bring up the image in a very small thing, which I'll show you here in a second. So we have to keep swapping the. Okay. So that brings us to this guy here. And what you're going to want to do there is you can zoom in a bit so that you can see what you're looking at. Then you take this slider around and you're just going to scroll through the individual frames until you find one that looks about right. Let's see. Can't really change the brightness or anything like that. Scaling is okay. So then you're going to try and bring this down to the AP settings here. And you just place the AP grid. It's going to throw up a bunch of different dots around the source file. And then after that, we go back to the other panel of this very bizarre. That guy there. What we'd hit is the analyze button, and that would sit around. It will analyze all the frames, tell you which ones are great, and it'll bring up a little graph here that shows you which one it is. Or after that, what you're going to do is set it to the auto size quality, and then you bring it over here to this portion, and each one of these boxes is going to tell you what percentage of frames that you're going to want to try and stack. And this will take anywhere from a couple of minutes to analyze it. And generally speaking, you'll be able to look at a graph and it'll tell you a pretty accurate representation of how good your frames are, and you can judge whether you want, well, 50, 60. But generally speaking, anywhere from 50 to 20, depending on the type of seeing and the conditions that you've got. Each one of these stacks will kick out each one of these boxes, you enter into another number, and it will kick out 50% for this, 20% for that, 10% of that. It'll create separate files with 10%, 50%, 20% of each one of them. Try and do the normalize, keep it sharpened. You don't need the RGB align, and then save it in individual folders. And this is the part that I was talking about earlier, is the option for drizzle. Sometimes this works and sometimes this does not work. Generally speaking, this is the same thing they were using on the Hubble to try and mathematically calculate what the pixel next to a given pixel should look like if you were to double or the size of the thing. In this case, I'm using 1.5 size, and it goes up to 1.3, or it goes up to 3.0 size for this. But apparently the 3.0 is just the 1.5 that is just manually resized the same way you would do it in AutoStack or in PixInsight or excuse me, Photoshop or something like that. Yep, pip and AutoStacker. And again, when we've got the files up, we're going to put the links to each one of these programs up later so that people can easily find them, along with a nice little PowerPoint presentation on specific instructions. So if I don't think I'm going through this too quickly, but yeah, if you don't know the names, I can see how that's going to be confusing. All right, so once we have stacked the object, we're going to take the entire thing and we're going to now throw it in we're going to save the file that it kicks out. It's going to throw it into a bunch of different folders. You pick the one that looks best, and we're going to throw it into, open it with a program called Registax. And Registax is where the main effort of the processing and the pre-processing is going to come into play. This is what it's basically going to look like. The image that we just had is going to kick out, and it's going to look something like this, which is a very fuzzy kind of dot. It's not quite as pixelated as the original shots that you got, but nice and round, still doesn't look all that great. So the first thing I generally do is I try and bring up the RGB balance, and this auto balance almost always works, and that you lose the orange, and it comes a nice little blue. And this looks more like what you've got in the eyepiece here. Another nice thing that you can do is when you're trying to do edit on this, the view zoom will bring in a slightly larger version of what you've already got, which again, sometimes helps more than others, depending on exactly how much you want to zoom in to try and pick out details. So from there, you go over here and you look for the type of wavelets that you've got. I think I have good luck with dyadic, but either one works pretty fine. From here, leave all these settings alone. If you come down here, you'll have 6 different layers. And these are just, and with a bunch of sliders attached to it. Each one of these is increasingly coarser details that you individually sharpened per layer. So the first layer will do something like that, versus the second layer will do something like that, and third, something like that. So each one requires a little bit less of a steady hand than the one before, less movement, so to speak. And then you just sort of move these sliders back and forth until you're starting to get the details that you want. This is actually pretty good. Generally, I don't need to go more than 3 or 4 in. There are some nicer things that you can do to try and sharpen it individually by clicking these up and down, or to denoise, which is just get rid of some of the fuzz a little bit later. Here you've got 1, 2, 3, you got all 4 moons, you've got some nice banding going on. There are no particular features other than the cloud bands happening there in the middle of it. So you will notice that when you do it like this, you've got this nice little ring around the planet. And this is using the cell phone. And I pretty much, I would expect something like this from the cell phone. If you do that, what you can, to get rid of these bright rings, you bring up this denoising thing right here. And you move from that, you take these sliders, and gradually speaking, you click each one, and it's going to start removing more and more. Not too much or you'll lose the detail, but bright side, dark side, that's just the sunny side and the waning side. You can actually tweak this enough to make it where it looks pretty good. And again, this is where some of the artistry comes in. There's no hard and fast rule on how to get the ring completely gone or the thing perfectly sharpened. And again, bringing down some of these wavelets will decrease the amount of ringing that you've got. That's just because of the way that it was set up. Okay. And once you have that set up the way you like, you can change the histogram to try and make it brighter or darker, depending. Let's say that guy's a little bit darker. Bring in and hit the stretch button there. It'll apply it. You hit the do all processing, it'll change what it was to what it is. And then you can save the file and you have your finished image. And that there is the basics behind planetary photography, such as it is. And that's it. That's the simplest ways of looking at the planetary photography. And if you get really good at it, you can actually do some pretty nice things. Gosh, I can't. For example, that was done with the cell phone and is not exactly the best stuff that we have out there. If you move on to some dedicated equipment, get slightly better views. If I can remember how to do this. Yep, there. You can see that we have different styles. This was done with a regular camera, the same thing. This is before you stacked it, and this is after I stacked it, which is using a ZWO 294 type camera, which is a pretty standard planetary camera and more or less a little better than introductory. It's the one everybody owns. This is another one that was taken last week. Pulling in a couple of different planets, again, using the Registax, and then Saturn. But all these were basically using the same techniques. It's just with a better camera. The cell phone makes things incredibly difficult to try and get a good shot on. So generally speaking, if you can invest in a $50 to $100 camera, such as this really cheap one that I found. I think this is probably $50 to $100. It's really worth it if you're getting into planetary photography and you want more than just a cell phone image. And that's it. The absolute rudimentary basics on how to use some of these programs. Again, if you go out and you take your own footage, you'll be able to actually sit around, play with these things individually, and figure out what works and what doesn't work for you and how these things all fit together. But in the simplest sense, that's all it is. Just take the picture, pre-process it, stack it, and then run it through a program to introduce wavelets to sharpen it up. If you're using the, it's a little bit easier to sharpen the image if you're using the GIMP. Using these NIC tools, there's a particular program called Sharpening Pro, in which case you've just got 3 sliders that'll affect focus and sharpness for individuals, and you can get some really nice images right off the bat by just applying the standard filter. And it's very fast, very quick. So that's the presentation for tonight. Any questions? Any hate mail that you don't feel like sending a stamp?
Nope, I thought it was pretty decent.
All right, beautiful. That's send
I
comments
especially
to,
like the PIP part because I started using PIP when it first came out, and I had a little difficulty with it at first, but then I found it to be okay. I haven't used it in a long time because I don't use these basic methods anymore. But.
Yeah, and mind you, these same methods will work just as well when you're using the better photography tools and things like that. In particular, they have things like quality estimators, so that when you're trying to slide around through the stacking program to find the best image to create your best wavelets, it'll pre-select the best one and move it to the front. The imposing thing about the PIP is a very powerful tool, and the imposing thing about it is that they seem to have so many options, and the same thing with Registax, that you get very intimidated by it when really there are only 2 or 3 settings that you need to change on it. In particular, for the cell phone and the basic video, they have the planetary stabilization. There's just 1 tab. There are some other things that you can do with pre-processing, throw in flats and darks. But again, we're using such short exposure times that darks really don't apply. If we were trying to, generally speaking, the darks will come in and will become more and more prevalent. You'll get more noise and you'll have more dead pixels that have become a bit visible when you use longer exposures. So by the time you get up to a minute, you'll see lots of little dots peering around the side of the image. Those can be clipped out by using dark images, which is basically taking a capped image on the scope at the exact same focal length. The same standard noise will apply on whether you're looking at the thing through an object or through black. And the object of darks is it takes several of these images at the same focal length, finds where all these dead pixels are, and you subtract those from your finished product. So you get a less noisy image. But when you're shooting with a nice camera at very high speeds, and we're talking like milliseconds of exposure time, those hot pixels just don't heat up. So you really don't need them. But when you're starting to image things like Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, where you'd actually want multi-second images, you're actually going to want to use some dark files in order to average out that noise in order to get a nice looking image. The flats can be very useful when you're trying to take shots of, say, the moon or the sun, where all the dust mites on your telescope will suddenly become very bright. But generally speaking, when I was looking at some images that I shot of Jupiter the other day, and I noticed that my Barlow was very, very dirty and throwing lots and lots of donuts onto the lens, what I found is that through the Lucky imaging system, it actually averaged out those little blotches fairly easily. So again, I've got plenty of shots of the moon that I've done that those donuts ruin the entire image. But at least for the planetary stuff I was doing the other night, there was enough movement, not necessarily self-dithering. It's a little bit different. But you know, that's the joke in astrophotography is the image moves while it's self-dithering. And no,
Yeah, it
but
does. Actually, it's not a joke. I know,
well,
like typically on my
say that.
sessions when I shoot, as I usually do about 90 seconds, because at my frame rate, that gives me 1,500 frames. Okay, that averages out just about anything.
It does, but the idea that the self-dithering has more to do with the static noise patterns and things like that. It doesn't work with the drift. But for this particular notion, yeah, the when you're shooting short focal length like this, it'll clip it out, so that you don't really need to worry about darks and flats until you start getting into deep space stuff. Just for that reason, unless you're one of those absolutely overachieving types that wants the perfect image to go sell to magazines and stuff like that. In which case, yeah, it never hurts, but it's more effort than it's worth to, you know, impress grandma or, you know, the grandkids, as the case may be. Judging by the looks of some of these faces, I think there are more grandkids than grandmas out there. But that's just a guess on my part.
I'm glad to see you turned into an auto stacker fan. I
It,
haven't tried 3. I've still been using 2, and you know, I loved 2, so I never changed.
well, I had trouble with 3 with some of the larger image files than I had, but I do like the one thing about 3 is the multi size align points, which for some reason is just like it's nice for the overlap. Looking for something that's it's perfectly lined
Makes
up like
sense.
that.
Well, thank you for a good, long-winded little presentation.
Yeah,
there.
it's
You need
one
a
of those.
drink.
It's one of those things. I promise. I really was. Every time I think this will take 10 minutes, and it's such a simple concept that it's record the thing for a few minutes and, you know, do this and do that. I forget. I've been doing this for like 10 years now, so it's a lot of this is just in the back of my mind.
And I just want to say, for like from my standpoint, you know, some of the stuff you said might sound too complicated for people that are trying to start. They're like, oh geez, histograms and all this kind of stuff, and you don't have to know any of that stuff to do this stuff either. When I have done like I don't know if you can see the picture in my background right now. That's Jupiter and 3 of the moons, and that's with my cell phone on my 10-inch scope, a Dob. And the thing was taking a little bit of video. I think that was only about 45 seconds of video, and then you can go on YouTube and find tutorial videos on how to use the PIP, you know, the PIP program. And I would do that while I'm doing it. I've got the video pulled up, and I hit play, and it says, okay, do this. And so I do that, and then hit play again. Okay, now click this button, hit pause, go click that button. And so I'll do it. And then, okay, now take it and put it in auto stacker. And then I find the video for auto stacker, how to use it. And there'll be somebody doing a video that's stacking a video of Jupiter, you know, and so I just follow along with them. And oftentimes they'll just keep it super simple. They'll just be like, do this real quick, do this real quick, do this real quick. And that's the most basic, without worrying about histograms and percentages or anything like this. It's just, okay, click, now you've got it stacked. Now you can, you know, go.
And
you
that's exactly how I learned, was going through and finding all these individual videos. The idea here is not to make experts of anybody. The idea is to give them an introduction to the types of things that you're doing. And once you actually get into it, you will, I think, like Ben and like myself and like Chris and pretty much everybody who's done this, find that you have specific questions, and you'll start Googling that, and you'll go look on the YouTubes, and you'll start finding more and more information. Speaking about the histogram, I think I probably passed over that a little too quickly, just because it's one of those concepts that's kind of hard to see, and the test camera wasn't showing me the changes. Basically, all that is a graph that shows how bright and how dark a thing is. To the left, you're going to see a little bit of a curve going around somewhere, and that's the amount of light that's coming in from the image. And the histogram is actually kind of important because it will tell you whether or not your shots are overexposed. If the line goes all the way to the roof, you're overexposed and you're going to need to lower your gain a little bit to bring the line down. If it's all the way to the right, you're overexposed and you're going to need to bring the exposure down so that it goes back down to the left. The idea is right is bright, left is dark, and you want to keep the thing off the floor from the left, but not so far that it's all the way to the right. You're going to keep it about 70% to the right. And this is just going to make sure that you're not completely overexposing your shots. So
Yeah,
even if it looks
when you
really
get into
good.
processing, it's a little bit different. You want to make sure that you don't crowd either end because you'll be dumping pixels and introducing noise.
And this is the same basic type of thing that you look at through the rest of your, if you want to move on in astrophotography, everybody starts off with planetary and then they graduate to other stuff. So some of the basic concepts still apply. For deep space stuff, you don't use the auto stacker, you find a completely different program. Auto stacker says that you use it it says it has a setting for deep sky. It doesn't. If you move on to deep sky, you move on to a different program called Deep Sky Stacker that'll do that type of thing. But some of the things still apply. The basic looking for the histogram, trying to make sure that it's off the floor, but not all the way to the right so that it's not too high on your peaks aren't too high and things like that. These things will change slightly because you're imaging dim things. The histogram is always slightly pretty far to the left. But when you start processing, the goal is to bring it into the center there. So it's really easy to learn some of these basic concepts while doing planetary stuff. And then if you really are interested and, just want to be broke for the rest of your life, you can try to do deep sky photography and learn that. So,
speaking of,
and our friend James is about to learn all of this because he is waiting for the postman to deliver him his Stellina, which he's been wanting forever and ever. Which is basically an automatic tutorial in basic astrophotography and all the trouble of pulling it out of a box, setting it in under a clear sky, and hitting.
There's definitely the amount of money put into it in technology.
Yeah, and the more money that you throw into astrophotography, the more money you throw into astronomy, the better. That's just all. The more money you're willing to spend, if you want to go get a 24-inch, you can. Yeah, but
you can bust the images from the thing and process it more. So for me, it's good because I just didn't want to get heavily into the hours long and 50 pounds of equipment. You know what I mean? So this thing, now I have the beast that I will absolutely do something with, especially planetary stuff. It would be great. But I just want to see what this does. I may send it back in 30 days, but I've reached out to so many different sources and I've heard really good things, but it's really nice to hear that and you can look at it and see the type of camera that's loaded in it, and it's top notch, but is it the same as sitting for hours, imaging and then processing an image? No, the raw picture isn't, but it's like almost a good picture.
Well, I mean, if you want to do,
you can crank it up a little more, and that way I can learn to filter. I can use the processing.
Sure. And if you want to get really nice photography, you can just leave it on the same target for a couple of hours, and it'll gradually. Right. You can get it that way.
It doesn't do well with planets, as you can imagine. I mean, there's no aperture for that.
Well, that's okay. It'll be fun to see what it can do, and
it does something about rotation too. If you're doing a really long, I mean, it's pretty fascinating. I can't wait to get it and use it, but I'm scared to put it in this heat. It might just explode. I mean,
it's definitely open. You might buy a cheap ice box to leave open next to it. I don't know.
And for Ben, I'm more than happy to use this for outreach stuff. I mean, you know, it's perfect for that.
Great.
Because,
Okay.
you know, kids want to
Cool.
see those images.
Let's
you
go
know.
ahead and finish up this portion of the meeting so that we can move on to the club's business. Do we have any more questions
Oh,
about the
sorry.
tonight's talk?
Well, not so many questions. You hear me?
Yeah.
But really, two things. One, for the Mac users, if you don't have Registax, there's an app called Lynkeos, Lynkeos, and it will do a lot of the same stuff. It has wavelets. It'll stack it. You can go through frame by frame and delete stuff you don't like. The second thing is, and Scott and I were talking about this when we came up with the idea of talking about planetary imaging. If you guys want to start imaging closer to the end of the month, please send your processed images to Michelle, and we can get it in the newsletter for August, and everybody can, you know, see what we've all
That would
done,
be cool.
and, you know, and see where everybody's at. If anybody's got any questions, we can always help. But I figured, you know, Saturn's up, Jupiter's up, Mars is up. This is your opportunity to really dive deep in planetary.
I'd say send it about 5 days before the end of the month. Send it to her.
Okay. In particular, anybody wanting to learn how to that doesn't have the equipment on them, that wants to come see how to do this, we do have a scope out at the observatory. You can't go there if you show up either for meetings or at some of our free nights, such as we're going to have coming up in August. We will have a scope that you can take out, and we have one of these little setting devices and things like that, so you can actually just come on out there with your cell phone, and we can get it all set up for you during a members night, or if you happen to volunteer and you get invited to stay after, and come try it out. We've got the equipment there for you to try these things. Or if you get very lucky and it's a slow night at the observatory and it's just one guy working the scope and nobody else there, he might let you borrow his equipment to take some images. In fact, if it clears, it does not look like it's going to clear up, but there was the Jupiter opposition tonight. It might have been possible to do that. Okay, any further questions about the imaging? Or nope. Okay, great. So I hope some of that would have at least slightly amused you, if not been somewhat informative and in some way or fashion. If I've wasted your time, I apologize. If
I'm
not,
about to get into it. Perfect timing. I think it was great.
Good.
Because I don't have a clue what I'm doing. Now
All
I
right.
have a little bit of a clue.
So this is going to conclude our program for the evening, and after this we're going to move on and we're going to do some club stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for posterity. So again, thank y'all for showing in. Thank y'all for how much y'all have watched and putting up with me trying to figure out the program on how to show you how these things that I've been trying to learn how to do myself. Feel free to drop by and join us for meetings when they continue in person in the future. And you can look for more videos on the YouTube channel and the Facebook page. So thank you very much. Have a good night.